Hello, and welcome to this special episode of ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia McLeod, and today I'm joined by ACRO's 2025 Board Chair Jim Reilly and Vice Chair Sandy Kennedy. Jim is President Development Cloud at Veeva, and Sandy is Chief Quality, Regulatory Affairs, and Sustainability Officer at Fortrea. Jim and Sandy sat down with me to discuss the current state of the clinical trials industry and where ACRO, and the industry at large, should be focused throughout 2025. We touch on topics like clinical trial access, the benefits of standardization, and the evolving relationship with clinical trial sites. Enjoy! Sandy and Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me for this special episode of GCP. We figured it wouldn't be right to start 2025 without talking to ACRO's new board chair and vice chair. And I wanted to pick your brains a little bit today about how you see ACRO and the broader industry today and maybe where you'd like to see things in the future. So Sandy, I think I'll start with you, and then Jim, please feel free to jump in as we kind of go through. So Sandy. While much of ACRO's advocacy to this point has really been focused on clinical research in the US and in Europe, a topic that has come up frequently is promoting the conduct of trials in other geographies around the world, where we see the massive untapped potential, let's say, for clinical research to make a difference. What benefits can promoting clinical research in these geographies have for the local community, both from a health and economic perspective, and then also on the drug development industry as a whole?
Thanks, Sophia. So great question with respect to, what is the impact that clinical research can have? Obviously benefits to the local communities and to the drug development industry, but then also to the patients and to where everyone benefits. So, the perfect win for everyone. You think about, first of all, the local communities. We've seen improved healthcare access. Clinical trials lead to the development of new treatments and therapies, and these can be specifically tailored to local population needs, and that's really important. Think about what clinical trials bring with respect to access and patient access. Now, while these clinical drug trials, are on experimental treatments and therapies or modalities, the access to those health screenings and diagnoses that are part of all clinical trials through the initial study intake, those are still very valuable and are available through clinical trials. Local communities and clinical trials raise awareness about overall health issues. We've seen a general promotion of healthier lifestyles just with a stronger clinical trials infrastructure and ecosystem, as well as just the ability to focus on diseases that would be more prevalent in certain geographies than in others, the US, Europe, et cetera, where clinical trials are currently more prevalent. But you also think about what it does to the local infrastructure as well. We've seen significant job creation to economic growth from the influx of these clinical trials with residents and the people that live there. A lot of economies and just the overall education aspect of what is a clinical trial, how to get involved, the ability to connect with international organizations, connecting with the Society of Clinical Research Sites, whomever it is that is conducting this research. Significant benefits there. And then at the same time, for the drug industry, we gain valuable insights from these new areas. Also access to very, very educated and skilled talent sets. Very significant for us in the pharmaceutical industry. So when you combine all of those benefits from the communities and to the pharmaceutical industry as well, you really do see that that collective great benefit. I'm going to end on the fact that one of the things that we have seen specifically as we've branched out into some of these other areas is we have seen firsthand innovative solutions. So I think that from individuals and exposures to different healthcare environments and those challenges, we've seen more innovative approaches to drug development and to healthcare delivery as a whole. So significant advantages from all perspectives as well as patients.
Any thoughts there, Jim?
Well, very well encapsulated, Sandy, and I agree wholeheartedly with your sentiment and most of your points there, all of your points. Um, but I'd like to actually turn it back to ACRO and our mission and what we're doing about this challenge that we're noticing as an industry about participation. Um, ACRO's mission is very simply educating stakeholders and advocating for policies that bring efficient, effective, and safe conduct of clinical research. And a big part of clinical trials being efficient and effective is for them to be accessible. And we have challenges in certain regions and countries where participation on a per capita basis is quite low compared to the rest of the world. And so at ACRO, we're digging in there to understand why that is, and hopefully to raise awareness that can drive things like further regulator reform, and also, I hope, some behavioral changes at the country level and the organization level when engaging with those regions.
So I want to stick with you for a sec, Jim. We're talking about expanding the geographies in which you guys are working. And so as we continue to become more global as an industry, there's a real need for, and we've talked about this before, the real standardization in research. And so, there have been efforts to identify areas where standardization would be beneficial on the data side, but a little bit less so, I think, on the operational side. So I would love for you, again, we'll have you start this time, then I'll kick it to Sandy, to just sort of talk through some of the benefits of standardization and how you believe the industry can go further in promoting this throughout the clinical research ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sophia. And you're absolutely right. I think, first of all, kudos to our industry. We did a lot of amazing work over the last 20 or so years on bringing a deep level of standardization to the way in which we collect, manage, and distribute clinical data. A lot of that was driven by the CDISC organization. And I think our industry has greatly benefited from that amount of standardization that comes with clinical data. And health agencies around the world have also benefited from more common review practices and ability to perform analysis. But on the flip side, the operation of clinical trials is not at par with that level of standardization. Now, in some ways, that's to be expected, right? Clinical trials are not incredibly routinized or machines like you'd see on a factory floor. There's some creativity, of course, that comes into clinical trials with development of the protocol and the way they're executed. And so absolutely there needs to be a level of uniqueness with how they're executed. But I think there's a little bit too much uniqueness, that with lack of consistency of process, that actually leads to inefficiency within any one organization, and I would argue the industry writ large. But also there's a lack of consistency of expectation from some of the stakeholders. Research sites are working in different ways with sponsors and CROs. Patients on account also are engaging slightly differently because of some of this lack of consistency on the operational side of trials. And so I think there really needs to be some further standardization defined here. And I think if you look at ACRO, we're doing a lot of great things in this area, and I think we can do more. But just to offer two examples, the RBQM working group that we've been leading for the last 5 years, RBQM being risk-based quality management, their ACROs run an annual survey of the landscape of the adoption of RBQM to gauge how that's going and how it's improving. And this has been a wonderful tool to drive awareness and advocacy for the effectiveness of risk-based quality management. I think we've seen a tremendous uptick in that behavior, bringing its sort of capabilities down to the operational side of trials. So that's one good example of the work that ACRO has been doing to drive standardization. The other is much more recent. The ICH E6 R3, release 3, which is the good clinical practice guideline, that was actually just finalized and it goes into effect in July of this year. But it's a guideline. It's not a instruction manual. And so there are things that are up for interpretation in it being a guideline, which means that again, much of the industry does things slightly differently, and that's not ideal for efficiency and effectiveness. So actually, ACRO has been working closely with Transcelerate, where we've teamed up and we have two sub teams. One of them is focused on risk management, and the other is focused on data governance. And those two teams have been developing a series of tools that organizations can use when interpreting and implementing that new guideline, E6R3. And so that's, to me, another great example of where, ACRO, the CROs, the technology vendors, and also the sponsors that we work with through Transcelerate are working together to meet the regulatory expectations and to implement that guideline in a more practical way. So I think there's more that we can do there to help standardize operations, but I think those are two great examples.
And at risk of showing my age, I mean, over my time in the industry, I feel that collaboration amongst entities, organizations, even with regulators, has been at an all-time high. So to kind of build on what Jim has well outlined so far, is ACRO with Transcelerate and other entities. I mentioned the Society of Clinical Research Sites in particular. We have seen a significant uptick in collective interpretations and ways in which we can implement and standardize these particular requirements. We've also seen within many countries that ICH, while they are guidelines, they have been adopted into regulation and law in many countries. So I think that we're seeing the regulatory expectations being more standardized there as well. So, I think that really has made a significant difference. One of the things Jim mentioned was the creation of some tools. And I think that there's one thing to have these discussions about the implications and the really understanding what the requirement is and what the guidance says or the regulation says. But when you actually work together and partner together with other organizations to create tools to be able to implement, and I think that really aids standardization as well. So again, I think that we're on a really good pathway. I wanted to also point out what we've done with regulators. One in particular, I think that case examples are really strong here. A year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago, ACRO worked specifically with the FDA on how to capture best in a standardized way in clinical study reports disruptions in a clinical trial. So when you think about disruptions that come from health health pandemics like COVID, and this was driven out of COVID, but also now you're looking at geopolitical situations that disrupt, environmental disruptions of hurricanes, fires, the floods that we've seen, where patients and investigator sites have massive displacements and disruptions in the conduct of clinical trials. ACRO worked together with the FDA to give them feedback on how we could standardize even just the reporting of some of those disruptions. So again, I looked at some of those very specific examples that earlier in my career, I just don't recall any of that level of discussion, openness, collaboration, and progress. So I think we're really going to be able to go off of a strong foundation of successes here for further standardization.
Yeah, I think we've seen a great evolution up to this point, and I think one that will really continue as we move forward. You both have mentioned sites, so I want to stick with sites for a second here. And Jim, maybe I'll start with you. I think we all agree that sites are an extremely vital part of clinical trials, but I do think we probably still as an industry have some room for growth and sort of how we optimize that engagement with the sites. When you think about the way that CROs and tech companies interact with the research site community at this stage, how do you think that relationship needs to evolve for us to really improve these partnerships?
Yeah. Thanks, Sophie. This is an area that I'm really passionate about. I've really come to understand what I call the plight of the site in the last 5 or so years, especially. And, you look at a lot of the data sources out there from the likes of SCRS and Tufts and ACRP. And, it's very obvious that today, unfortunately, there's still a tremendous amount of burden that's put on research sites to perform research. And I think it's one of the reasons why we still see to this day the kind of turnover that we see in investigators, and also some of the unfortunate slowness that I think we'd all like to see improve with research, because research sites are the ones that are doing the research. It's not the sponsors, it's not the tech companies, it's not the CROs, it's the research sites and their people. And they want to spend their time seeing the patients, but a lot of the time, unfortunately, is spent in administrative work, dealing with systems and tools and documents and not seeing the patients. And so I think unfortunately a lot of that burden has come to them from our industry. But the good news is that we're doing a lot of things to improve that. I think through the lens of technology, a lot of tech players are coming up with novel and innovative ways to make it simpler on sites to capture information and to log in a consistent way to systems and to be part of the workflow with sponsors and CROs. I think that's improving. Still some room to go. Um, but the other thing is I think it's about engaging more with the site community. There are these fantastic site groups that I mentioned, and there's many more, where I think more than ever, that our industry is getting much closer to the sites to understand the way they work and what pains them. And I think we can even go a step further. I think organizations like tech players and CROs, especially as service providers, we can spend more time with the sites, visit them, understand how they work, really see what it's like for them to conduct their day to day to understand how things can be improved. And again, I think that's starting to happen, but I'd argue it can happen even more. At ACRO, one of the nice things that we just launched last year is something that we call the Site Resource Grants Program. And this was devised as a program to support some pilot sites, 7 of them, in fact, on a 12-month pilot project. And they're in the US. And these are 7 projects that are focused on innovative strategies for improving representative enrollment in clinical trials. And the sites that are involved in this program, they vary in terms of their experience level, their geographic location in the US, the therapy area focus they have. But for all of them and for ACRO's work with them, the goal is to help these sites gain things like the resources they need, more experience in conducting the research, and also the skills they need to be selected for sponsored studies, and ultimately improve the reach of clinical trials into communities where access to those trials is more of a challenge. So I'm really proud of that work that ACRO is now putting forth with these sites, and we'll be engaging with them to understand how well it's going and hopefully how we can further support them in the future.
I think that just to underscore what Jim has said is giving these sites individually and collectively a voice. And I think that we haven't always done that as a industry of ensuring that we have full representation from these investigator research sites to understand truly what the problems are and the challenges that they're facing, what it takes to identify patients, to enroll them, to keep them engaged and enrolled, all of those challenges that Jim had mentioned. And I think that by working together, fostering that transparency and collaboration, we can help them. And we can help them together, as opposed to every single company trying to come up with their own innovation and solution. And I'm going to put that in air quotes because one person's solution is another person's new problem. And I think that's the way we've kind of gone about it thus far. And that's resulted in those redundancies. We have a great opportunity to streamline, pare it down, and work together here for the general good. So I'll give another example of how we've worked together historically for a specific success. Investigator sites, as Jim said, all sites come into this arena with a varied backdrop of experience, education, knowledge, connections, etc. So standardizing training, not protocol-specific training, but the GCP training, how to run a clinical trial, what are the ethical foundations of conducting a clinical trial, etc. Every single study repeated that basic site training and the qualifications of participating in a clinical trial. And it was very time consuming for every single member of staff, regardless as to how many trials they had done in the past, etc. So again, working with the Society of Clinical Research side, as an industry, we were able to sit down, take a look at standardizing of some training and have more mutually accepted site qualifications and the reciprocity of acceptance of site GCP training. So again, I know that's a very specific example, but I like to look at what we've been able to succeed in the past and use that as a true impetus to say we can do this, that we can tackle these types of challenges, even though all of our companies are independent and certainly are seen as competitors in our market space. Collectively, we are all part of the solutions in progressing forward with our investigator sites. Now, our CRO has a unique phrase that I'm just going to pull forward here because he calls it trying to just solve, going that last mile. And when you think of all that we've done for our advances in our technologies within our respective companies, and now we're really focusing in on the site because getting, the site working well, ensuring that they are supporting their patients, and getting out of the administrative burden, as Jim mentioned, and really being able to focus on the patient. That's really significant opportunity for us.
Yeah, that old phrase, a rising tide, lifts all the boats. I feel like that's very apt for our industry. But I have one final question for you both. And Sandy, we'll start with you for this one. We've touched on it a bit in the last answer, but we have really been focused as an industry on reducing barriers in order to expand access and broaden participation, and therefore creating more representative clinical trials. This has been a focus for a little while now in the industry. I was hoping you both could talk a bit about the impact that more representative trials have on the quality of the data that's gathered during the trial, and then ultimately the treatment that goes to market. And like I said, Sandy, maybe we'll start with you.
Perfect. Well, when you think of diversity and inclusion in a clinical trial, it goes so far beyond just race or gender or any one specific parameter. Diversity and inclusion in trials is good science. It propagates insights and conclusions that are based on data. So it's good science. Now, when you think about it in a clinical research context, you think about the broad range of people that will ultimately use that particular compound, device, whatever, what have you, that's being tested. So inclusion is really more about creating that equitable opportunities for eligible individuals to participate. So that includes addressing barriers that might prevent them from enrolling. So when you think about some specific examples of diverse population, you think of age, geographic location, socioeconomic status comes into that as well, abilities or disabilities, as well as genetic, biological, or even other health factors. For example, inclusion of pregnant women in trials. So, we have a full slate of characteristics here and examples of diverse populations and what would make someone a diverse patient. When our trials lack diversity, they actually fail to capture exactly how treatments will affect these different populations. And then the disparities that can obviously lead to. You think about inequitable health outcomes. When something is tested on a narrow demographic, biased dosage and efficacy data, lower public trust in medical research. And to me, this is a very, very significant obstacle that we can overcome. And then obviously, getting to more effective, safer, and widely available treatments. So again, I know I've given a number of specific examples here of how patients benefit from these advancements as we look to ensure a broader equity, not just benefits for a select few. So those are some of my thoughts on why it's such a critical discussion to have right now, and an imperative because it is good science.
Jim, your thoughts?
Very well said, Sandy. Wholly agree. I would just add the science to your point, and this being good science, it's evolved. We are in the age of personalized medicine now. There are therapies that are oriented to the person and their unique genomics. Yet we tend to over-index towards certain populations.
Mm.
And while that might be statistically powered, in the strictest sense for our trials, what ends up happening is that we find safety issues or unintended consequences after the product goes out in the broader market. And I would argue it's also an ethical imperative to do our best to avoid that from happening. We don't want to see these, you know, safety issues prop up when they could have been prevented in the first place by providing better access to the trials for participants that should fit the criteria and that might exist in areas where we don't often look at trials. And I think some of that unfortunately goes into commercialization pathways for us as an industry where we're looking to market the product that we're seeking approval for. And so therefore, let's run trials or index more towards trials being run in that area. But over time, any of these products expand their footprint, and we're left getting surprised, and the human population then gets affected by this lack of accessibility for the trial in the first place. So I'm fully on board with what Sandy has been sharing, and I think it's high time for us in industry to look at how we really increase the access to our therapies when in clinical trials.
Well said, both of you. I think it's going to be a really exciting year with you two leading the ACRO board. I know I and all of the staff are looking forward to what we're going to get up to this year. We think we have a long list of things to do. So I look forward to working with both of you as the year goes on. And I think that's it. Thank you both so much for joining me. Thanks for tuning in to this special episode of ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. We'll see you back here very soon for season 3.